Hi, you guys. Welcome back to C-Squad Cinema, a compendium for physical media, film reviews, rambles, and other nerdy movie talk. Well, if you're familiar with the concept of Noir-vember, you'll know that that means every time November rolls around, it's time to start watching some of the very best film noir. And if you're watching this, I'll assume you know what film noir is. No, it doesn't literally mean a black and white movie or dark feature film. Film noir is a cinematic styling, or its own genre, really, of film. And of course, it was really popularized throughout the 40s and 50s, dealing with the gumshoe detectives and private eyes investigating, murders and cheating spouses and the nefarious deeds that were taking place in the seedy areas of cities across America. But film noir is still being made today. A lot of times it'll be referred to as neo-noir when it's sort of that post-modern era. One of the best film noirs of the modern era is LA Confidential. I could do a whole video about that film because if people ask me, what is your favorite film? Well, of course, I never really have an answer for them. You can't pick a favorite when you're a cinephile. But LA Confidential is the one that I may cite the most often as one of my favorites. I could rewatch that thing on a consistent basis and never get tired of it. But rather than give you a whole rundown of film noir throughout history or a whole list of all the best film noirs, because that would make for a really long video, I'm going to talk about one that maybe has flown under the radar for some of you that are also fans of film noir, and that is Orson Welles' Touch of Evil. Now, I'm going to assume you know who Orson Welles is. He was a titan of cinema in the golden era of movie making. He was sort of a Steven Spielberg of his time. Orson Welles was huge. Now, of course, everybody knows him from Citizen Kane. And what more can be said about Citizen Kane? You either hate it because it's been talked about so much, or you love it and you talk about it a lot because it is consistently ranked as among cinema history's greatest films ever made. Do I feel that way? Well, yes, I do. I think Citizen Kane is a remarkable achievement. Now, he was a controversial figure. He was known to be difficult to work with at times, but there's no denying the mark he left on Hollywood and filmmaking as a whole. He was somebody that was way ahead of his time, especially with some of his shooting techniques and the angles he would take, or the use of theme throughout some of his films. Touch of Evil is film noir through and through. There's a lot that would be on people's top 5 list before Touch of Evil, but I'm going to argue that it deserves a place closer to the top of the best film noirs of all time. This came toward the end of the golden era of the film noir, really toward the end of the 50s. This was 1958, written and directed by Orson Welles. And Touch of Evil deals with some dark stuff, and it's got a bit of controversy of its own. So we're going to talk about it. Now, I know it's common practice for films in the Hollywood system or produced by major studios to be interfered with. It happens all the time, and I'm sure we all have an example of one of our favorite films that was butchered before it was released, and maybe an alternate version that exists because the filmmaker was allowed to come back and tinker with it until they got something closer to their original version. Well, Touch of Evil is one early example of a lot of studio interference. Orson Welles had started work on the picture, and when studios started meddling, he kind of got distracted and he went to Mexico to start working on something else. And so the studio basically decided to have actors come back in, reshoot a whole bunch of stuff, and make something that wasn't really Orson Welles' film. So there are really 3 well-known versions of Touch of Evil. There's what was released theatrically, and that comes in around 90 some odd minutes. There was a preview cut prior to the theatrical release that was around 109 minutes, and then there is a reconstructed version, which is closer in intent to what Orson Welles wanted to make, and that comes in at 111 minutes. So unfortunately, Orson Welles did not live to see the full realization of his intent come to light because the reconstructed version of Touch of Evil wasn't completed until 1998. I will just say this right now. That is the one to watch. And if for no other reason than because the opening minutes of the film start with this one tracking shot. I mean, one camera, one tracking shot that's moving throughout this town along the Mexican-American border. And it's a marvel. It is impressive for its time. Well ahead of the game. We all have examples of modern movies that make really effective use of an impressive tracking shot, but Orson Welles had this down well before anybody else. And one of the unfortunate side effects of the studio interference is that they completely reworked the opening scene of Touch of Evil. They threw credits on it and some music that didn't fit tonally with the film. And the reconstructed version takes out the credits and takes out that opening music track, because a big reason that sequence is so impactful is because it's not just the camera going to these different spots in one tracking shot. It's that as things move in and out of the frame, you're getting the specific audio of that thing that's happening at the moment that it's happening. So to edit in music that doesn't belong there, you lose some of the impact of that sequence. It is masterful filmmaking just in the opening few minutes. So if you watch the reconstructed version, you're immediately hooked into this story. So the film follows Charlton Heston, who here is playing Mexican Special Prosecutor Miguel Vargas. That in and of itself is controversial, even to this day. I think people had an issue with a white American playing a Mexican, but I think the movie kind of doesn't need to say right out loud he's a Mexican American, but I think it's pretty clear that he is. And I don't know what the film did to achieve the look for him, but in black and white footage, which you wouldn't know by looking at the cover, but in the film, he plays a pretty convincing role. Now, he's on a honeymoon with his wife, played by Janet Leigh, famously well known to be Jamie Lee Curtis's mother. And let me tell you, in her heyday, she was absolutely gorgeous. She's riveting in this film. And as they're enjoying their honeymoon, this car drives by with some kind of diplomat in it, and it explodes. So then the movie follows Miguel as he wants to be involved in the investigation of the bombing. Even though it happened on the American side of the border, he knows something's not quite right because it involves some Mexican citizens. And so pretty soon, Orson Welles' character, Hank Quinlan, is introduced as the officer who's investigating this bombing, and his right-hand man, Pete Menzies, who becomes a central figure of the story as well. So Touch of Evil really deals with themes of corruption taking place within this town along the US-Mexico border. Totally relevant. Now, it's pretty dialogue heavy. A lot of scenes in the movie involve characters just standing around having conversations as Miguel comes to realize more and more that Detective Quinlan is corrupt and likely has something to do with the bombing himself. But that's just the meat and potatoes of the story. It's with the execution here that makes this one of the better film noirs of its era. You know, like I said, the opening tracking shot is unforgettable. You can't unsee it once you've experienced what it's like. And to see modern films that so clearly look to the past to let some of those types of scenes influence the films of today, it speaks to the legacy that some of the greats of Hollywood left for us, like Orson Welles. Like him or not, the guy brought some innovation to an industry that very much needed it. You know, he told good stories. He worked hard to bring good direction to the film, and here he turns in a very credible performance, and his character is somebody you come to hate. So in addition to being really relevant thematically to today's political environment, this is also a great innovation of filmmaking. Just really, really expert filmmaking. You know, everybody talks about Double Indemnity and The Maltese Falcon as being some of the gold standard for film noir. But if I was you, I would add Touch of Evil to that list. Now, I will likely never watch the theatrical version. By all accounts, that is a bastardized, butchered version of Orson Welles' film. The preview cut and reconstructed cut, I'm going to assume, are comparable because they're only 2 minutes in time difference. Now, I watched the reconstructed cut, and I'm going to tell you, with this 4K, it looks immaculate. Of course, a film stock of this age is going to show some wear and tear, but Kino Lorber here has done a really loving restoration of this film. What's great is, if you want to decide which version of Touch of Evil is your favorite, we get 3 4K discs, each dedicated to each version of the film. So you get a 4K disc with the reconstructed cut, and then you get a disc each for the preview and the theatrical cut. But guys, Touch of Evil is fantastic. Absolutely recommend this for those of you that love film noir. This is a good pickup. It's a great 4K with a lot of value in each version of the film. So that's it. It's Noir-vember. There is more to come. I will probably cover a couple more film noir titles before the month is out. But until then, this has been C Squad Cinema, and I'll see you next time.